Can I have your attention, please? So welcome back to plenary number 3, I think. So we're talking for an hour, in fact, slightly less, 54 minutes, about carbon dioxide removal and national policy making. And as I said in the opening discussion, I should say I'm Cameron Hepburn, Battcock Professor of Environmental Economics, if you weren't here yesterday. One of our kind of ludicrous privileges here at Oxford, of which there are many, is that we can get such a wonderful group of people together, all of you with great expertise. And also, we can then get the key movers and shakers who have great insights about the policy-making world together with us to share their thoughts. And I will just introduce them now. So right next to me here is Professor Gideon Henderson, Professor of Earth Sciences at the University of Oxford. I'll just say that Gideon has cancelled all his other speaking engagements over the last few weeks other than this one. So we're very grateful, I'm not going to say anything else, to have him with us today. He's here in his personal capacity as a professor at Oxford. He also lives even closer to this building than I do, which is quite a remarkable feat. In fact, probably the final thing I should say about Gideon is I think there's, in some real sense, none of us would be here were it not for him, because he kind of puppeteered a range of things that put CORE and this program into motion, although doubtless he would deny it. Next to Gideon is Fabiola Zerbini, who is the director of the Department of Forests in the Ministry of Environment in Brazil. Obviously, a vital part of the world, a vital part of that part of the world to have with us today. We're very, very happy to have you here, Fabiola. She has a legal background and a PhD in environmental science. And actually, one of the things I did to just prep this panel is I looked up the publications, the top-cited publication of all of our panelists, who all have doctorates, on Google Scholar. And I'm going to read them out for you in just a little moment. You can see if you can fit the publication to the panelist. I mean, what's a panel for if not a little bit of fun? I can see this, really, what? Subjecting me to this indignity. Anyway, next to Fabiola is Jen Wilcox. Again, I mean, we're just delighted to have Jen. I know several of you in the room have said, you mean she's actually here in person? I can speak to her. Jen is the Presidential Distinguished Professor of Chemical Engineering and Energy Policy at UPenn. And she was, until recently, in the US government, thinking about these issues, masterminding them, with an exceptionally long title, which if I didn't write down, I would be sure to miss out one of the adjectives. But it is, you are the former Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary at the US Department of Energy, and also associated with Isometric, who have an event this evening with B0 and WRI. So welcome, Jen. And finally, and certainly not least, is Fabien Ramos, who's Policy Officer at DG Klima in the European Commission, leading on carbon removals there. And among the 4 of them, we've got Europe, we've got the US, we've got Brazil, and we've got the UK. Fabien's PhD was in geosciences, and that takes me now to the fun bit. Who wrote what paper? Now, these are co-authored, many of them, so they're not necessarily the lead author, but this is the top-cited paper of each of the 4 of them, in no particular order. And some of you in the room might be co-authors of some of these papers, so no particular order. Paper 1, Carbon Capture and Storage, The Way Forward. Number 2, Climate Change Impacts on EU Agriculture, a regionalized perspective taking into account market-driven adjustments. Somebody knows the answer up there. Paper 3, the quantification of Holocene Asian monsoon rainfall from spatially separated cave records. You've got it here. There's an awful lot of expertise here, ladies and gentlemen. And finally, and before I start this, I'm just going to nod to my children, because I say to them very frequently, at least once a week, it doesn't matter if you're going to screw it up. Just give it a go. You've got to try things. So here we go. First time ever speaking a language I don't speak in a public setting. Dialogo iniziale entre educação para o consumo responsável e o comércio ético e solidário. Thank you very much. So we will come back to who fits which paper at the end. We're not having pre-prepared speeches or PowerPoints or anything. This is a chat. It involves you. You've got your C-vent thingy, there, live Q&A. I'm monitoring it. The questions need to come in. You've got Europe, US, UK, Brazil. And until the first question comes in, we'll sit here in silence. No, that's not true. So even if you had loads of questions, I've got things I'd like to ask. So I wanted to start by asking the question, what is the role of government in removing greenhouse gases? I'm an economist. We have to be persuaded that government should do anything. Okay. Governments need to do things. But Gideon, I'm going to ask this to you. What should government be doing here?
Thanks, Cameron. It's great to be here. And I want to, first of all, respond to your slightly cryptic remark about this being the only public engagement I'm doing at the moment. So I do have a government-facing role, but in this pre-election period, I'm very much here as a University of Oxford professor. And it's legitimate in this context because I do have quite a long history of working in this area of CDR, particularly in the open system technologies around enhanced weathering and ocean CDR. And that background will, I think, shine through in some of the comments that I make today. So to answer the question, after that little preamble, to answer the question, I think there are 4 distinct roles for governments to play in this landscape. And the first one of which is to fix market failures. And this, in order to get CDR working at scale, there are things that need to happen. So you need to do some R&D, which needs to be publicly funded. You need to overcome startup costs, which can need significant investment. And sometimes you need to help to take the public and the economy with you along that track. Secondly, it's really important that governments look after environmental stewardship. That is the role of governments, and all governments have some sort of environment department. And these applications of CDR technology all have environmental implications, sometimes positive, but often negative. And there is a role for governments to think about that and police it properly. And that brings me on to the third thing governments need to do, which is they need to regulate. They need to set the regulatory environment. And that means regulation, but sometimes deregulation to enable these technologies to operate, but making sure that when they do operate, that they're operating in a way which is environmentally safe and safe for humans as well, and not health implications of that activity. That's both domestically and internationally as well, I think. And the final thing, just quickly, the other thing governments need to do, and we're not quite there yet, but at some point we will need to do international accounting. So we're going to have to put this stuff into NDCs, and that's definitely a role for government.
Great. We're going to go to audience questions very quickly, I can see, because there's already a half dozen. But let me just quickly, Gideon, follow up on the deregulation point. What rules do we need to get rid of here?
Well, I think it's a case-by-case thing, so you need to look at the technology and work out where there might be barriers that are blocking it and whether those barriers are there for a good reason. But I think one example is the legislation around the London Convention, London Protocol, which is likely to cause limitations on some of the ocean technologies. We need to look at that. It'll be an international conversation that could be quite tricky because some countries are very much less positive about these technologies than others. But that sort of deregulatory environment is as important as regulation.
Okay, super. Let's leap across the pond with, I think, an emissions of about a ton of CO2 to Jen and go to the US. And Jen, perhaps tell us from the US government perspective, what have you been most excited, which policies have you been most excited by? You had a great time in office, I'm sure, enjoyed yourself, and mobilized some capital. What would you highlight as the successes of that period?
Sure. So I think, a lot of folks have heard about the direct air capture hubs. It's pretty exciting. Each one of those hubs has to remove 1 million tons of CO2 from the atmosphere through direct air capture coupled to geologic storage. But the question is, can we get to that scale, and how long is it going to take us? And so to me, I get excited about some of the other investments that we're making that maybe don't receive so much attention. And so one of them is the government procurement opportunity that we have. We made an announcement of $35 million for government procurement of carbon removal. And what that equates to, if you think of it as like $600 or $700 a ton, it's only 50,000 tons of removal. But that scale is really critical. So publicly we're funding R&D, but it's really about the demonstration and the pilots. And there's this big gap of funding that helps to shepherd these emerging technologies to get to the demonstrations. And so looking at opportunities like that, we also got a match from Google, which was really exciting. Mm-hmm. So you could imagine another 50,000 tons.
Yeah.
And then more recently, we had a prize structure announcement where we announced pilot prizes pre-commercial. And so really just looking at kind of the kiloton scale per year for engineered solutions to try to get us through and make sure that we have the technologies that will be strong and robust for the direct air capture hubs to scale up to 1 million. So I get excited about that. And I also get excited that every dollar that's going out the door through the infrastructure law, and the Department of Energy got a pulse of $62 billion to spend over 5 years, 18 specifically for carbon management. And every dollar that goes out the door is coupled to community benefits plans. And the private sector doesn't necessarily have to have this part of their project. But by having these government dollars and by having this example of how to do projects not that are just removing carbon, but that are also taking care of people at the end of the day, I think is really critical.
Oh, that's fantastic. I just follow up. So of the 18 billion that's going for carbon management, and I think the direct air capture hubs are, what, 3.5-ish billion?
3.5.
How does the average American voter feel about those dollars? Do they see them? Do they think this is great? Do they think we're helping American jobs, or do they
Can
think
I just
we're...
say, I've only been back at Penn 2 weeks, and chemical engineering professors don't know.
Okay. That's a fair dodge, I'd say.
No, but I mean is to the average taxpayer, there needs to be more communication of actually what tax dollars are doing. And I think for me, being in the government for 3.5 years, I better understand that. And going back to Penn, I have, when I see my students defending and, chemical engineering, and you're talking about the second law of thermodynamics, and my goodness, it's so expensive to take CO2 out of the atmosphere. Who would ever pay for it? My answer is you're paying for it, it turns out.
I guess it's what I've probably just done some dodgy maths in my head, but it's not even $100 a person, is it, in the US, something like that? Probably 50 thereabouts. Okay, let's jump back closer to home and go to Europe. Fabien, I'd like to ask you basically a similar sort of question to Jen. Where do you think the EU is? Which policies, which actions are you proud of? What would you like to highlight to a room as success stories?
Yeah. Maybe I can, for today, focus a little bit on one of the aspects that Gideon mentioned, on the importance to be sure that from an environmental perspective, we are doing these things correctly, so sustainability and accounting. Because one of the files on which we are working now is to make sure that in Europe, in order to integrate carbon removals in EU policy, we have a solid and robust framework for the monitoring, the reporting, the verification of carbon removals. And this year, the European Parliament and the Member States agreed on a legislation that we call CRCF. It goes for carbon removal and carbon farming. Right. And the idea is exactly that, is to develop methodologies, to agree on methodologies on how should we account carbon removal, on the sustainability criteria, what type of carbon removals, on the robustness, on the monitoring, etc. So I think this is something that is essential, and this is the first step that we need in Europe to develop the policy, because simply this is what we need to bring trust on that. And if you want to develop carbon removal, carbon removal is not a given that everybody trusts in carbon removal. There is a lot of debate, a lot of discussion in Europe where you have to advocate for carbon removals, and we think that this tool could help in this way, could provide some guarantees.
Great. Well, I think you're absolutely right. Okay, and then perhaps seamlessly moving from the removals side or MRV on removals and making sure that we've got trust in the removals, to Fabiola to talk about the land side. Obviously, as we saw yesterday from Steve, the bulk of what we've got at the moment is land-based. It's going to be a big part of the story, even if it isn't the total part of the story or even the big growth part of the story, but it's obviously very important. You're in there, forests, land. How are you thinking about the use of land for these competing purposes? I think we had a question from Joe House on day one about the classic food removals, energy, fuel, trade-offs, etc. What are your thoughts?
Thank you. Well, first of all, I have a short history. A friend in Latin America, we asked her to talk in English, and she told, I can talk in English, but I cannot inspire in English. So I will do my best here, but this is important to be mentioned because I think one of the key roles of governments are the inspirational one. And by example, so thanks for bringing this topic to the example, like the public one, to the table. Well, focusing on your question, the context in Brazil is pretty much like the emissions or the high emissions or the reduction of the emissions is totally connected with how we will deal with the combat deforestation and how we will deal with the restoration public national policies. So this is now, we are exactly right now reviewing the climate plan. And the mitigation climate plan, there are 8 sectors or 7 to 8 sectors, but the land use is the one that it's now bringing like the attention of the whole government to the forest sector. And this is interesting, like we had never experienced a situation where the forest agenda was put in the center of the climate discussions and the governmental decisions makers. We are now talking with the finance ministry almost weekly to bring the numbers and to build scenarios about how much it would cost to restore 12 million hectares by 2030, how much would cost to really eradicate deforestation, legal and illegal, by 2030. And this is super important because if we do not put a price and if we do not really managed, like internally as a governmental institution, as a whole government, not only the environmental ministry, not only specific departments of each agenda, it will not be really implemented. And to have in Brazil contributing to its own NDC and contributing to 1.5, it's crucial to have both public policies on being implemented. And I am now working on the restoration one, and very connected with the combat of deforestation. And what we really understand is that we cannot bring only the perspective that the governments will pay by each hectare to be restored or to really guarantee each hectare to be avoid deforestation. So my last comment on this is the catalyst role of governments are really key. So we are now really bringing another perspective, public-private one, to really guarantee that this goals, 12 million hectares and zero deforestation, will be understood as a country and as a global target, but for sure having the government as the main catalyst.
Well, Fabiola, I think you can be inspiring in English as well. You can take that home. Now, in principle, we have another 20 minutes chatting between ourselves like this. But I've just looked at the questions, and there are 20 queued up. And there's a sort of, I can't actually see who's lobbying who, but there's a horse race of upvotes going on. And not without a small amount of regret, I have to say that the top question is by Professor Miles Allen from Oxford. Well done, Miles.
He's got the 20 phones under the table that he's busy voting for himself.
He's texting his student list, upvote me now for a distinction. But it's actually a super important question. Now I was thinking, how do I get some structure on this? Because obviously the answer is it's going to be a mix of consumers and taxpayers and possibly some corporates. But I'm actually going to try and pin each of these guys down in a totally unfair way. I think, Miles, you might like this. I want you to give me 3 numbers that depict the percentages of who's paying, right? Because it's not as if anybody's going to pay. So,
just the question was,
who's paying? Oh, thank you, Miles. Sorry for my poor chairing. Who should pay?
Yes.
It's such an important question. I thought, I know, you're quite right. Who should pay for carbon dioxide removal? So, the possible candidates are the polluters, so the people putting it up there, That's category 1. Category 2 is the taxpayers. And yeah, I guess you kind of virtually have some sense of who that is. And category 3 I'm going to put as consumers, and I'm going to be a little bit vague about that. They might be energy consumers, they might be, so basically you're adding the costs into the economy in some way that isn't through the tax system. So basically producers of pollution, taxpayers, or consumers effectively that are causing the pollution. Okay, I hope you're going to appreciate. No, Miles doesn't like my framework.
And the producers. The polluters.
He's calling them polluters.
Of the materials that when you burn them, generate pollution.
Yeah, okay, well, I'm going to say, let's not... So producers, taxpayers, consumers.
They got away with it again. The fossil fuel industry always gets away.
No, that's what I mean. The fossil fuel industry are the producers of the pollution.
That's only scope 1 and scope 2.
No, okay, scope 3 included. All right. I knew this would happen. That's why I saw Miles Allen. I thought, oh, God. Okay, so producers including scope 3. Taxpayers, thank you, Miles. And consumers. So 3 numbers, that's your 3 shares. Gideon, hit us.
I think that I'm not going to quite give you 3 numbers. You're going to have to, it will change in the lifetime of the product. So I think that direct taxpayer, government spending will need to play a bigger part early on. Mm-hmm. But when we get on later in the more mature market, well, first of all, of course, it's always the people who pay for it. It doesn't matter which route it comes to them. Sooner or later, they're going to pay for it in the products they use. But I would anticipate that the government and the taxpayers have a relatively small role directly funding it, and it is the polluters, stroke producers, and the consumers. And those two are quite tightly coupled, because if the gas company the petrol company is paying because they're polluting, as Miles wants to, but then the consumer has to pay more for the fuel, and when they burn it, they're polluting and they're consuming. So it basically says not government once it's mature.
Okay.
It's government when it starts.
So we won't have a masterclass on the price elasticity of demand of fossil fuels and the pass-through rates and tax incidence. That's kind of what you're getting at.
Yep.
I'm just interested in the direct consequences. But basically, government to start, government fades away, then some mix of producers and consumers. Okay, Fabiola, your thoughts?
Well, again, not easy to answer directly by percentages, but I always try to bring the concept of the negative economic externalities. Mm-hmm. That the way, the main economic sectors in each country, beyond agriculture, but also mining, but also gas, etc. Other countries, other problems. So if you bring to the equation, first is producers, polluters, because they are in some way, winning their own incomes, but they are sharing the I don't know how to say it in English, but the onus, of the. Yeah. So by saying that, but again, the government has a big role, mainly in countries where common and control, land regularization, environmental regularization are still very important. Like without this, we will never, change. For a carbon zero or etc. Economic, macroeconomic or microeconomic perspectives. So the government needs to pay by this structuring main actions to really guarantee that the market, private sector, civil society also has a safe place to.
Okay. Super, nice, complicated, but appropriately complex answer there, Fabiola. Jen, you've had time to think.
I have, it's great. So I really liked what Gideon said, and I'm going to kind of piggyback off of that structure. Yeah. And dig a little deeper. Like when you think about the fossil fuel companies, for instance, I think that when we think about energy extraction, and we think about also thinking about kind of scope 1 emissions for others, in heat and power production. I think that it could be interesting for those energy companies that are responsible for extracting energy resources from the earth, recognizing that their workforce, that the capital investments that they make in drilling wells for energy products, that they can use and leverage that infrastructure to put carbon back underground. And that if we think about, like in the United States, the policy incentives that we have, like our 45Q tax credit, but the Treasury says we're only going to have about $2.3 billion over the next 10 years in that tax credit. But we have to think about how we can steer those energy companies such that when they're putting infrastructure in, that the infrastructure can also be used long-term for putting the carbon pollution back. So there's that piece. Separate from the energy sector, I think we have to think about industrial supply chains, and those are different because then we start to think about scope 3. And to me, investing in decarbonizing supply chains is critical. Not all of them have such intensities of fossil fuel input. When we think about cement, for instance, it's a chemical reaction that produces CO2. But if we invest in decarbonizing supply chains, it takes some of the pressure off of carbon removals. A lot of corporations are investing in carbon removals to offset scope 3. And so if we can really think about how do we decarbonize supply chains and thinking about specifically the policies in place to decarbonize supply chains, I think is also critical.
Fabulous. And Fabien, a quick answer here.
Yeah,
I was hoping to get some percentages.
But it's a pity because it's really a question I love, and I would be very happy to spend a lot of time on it. But to make it short, in Europe we have a principle we try to apply. We don't apply always, but we try to apply the polluter pays principle. And the question is, but what do you mean by polluter? Is it the emitter? Is it the one that brought the carbon out of the fossil reserve? Is it society? Society is creating the demand for this pollution. So you can have a different views on that. And when you look at the European policies, the first one to pay, because at the end, the cost will be passed, and this is the society that is going to pay. But the first one to pay, in some cases, like the ETS on industrial installation, it's the emitter. In other cases, it's more the supplier. For instance, the second ETS on buildings and transport, where this is the fuel company, so the downstream supplier, let's say, is paying. We have now a Net Zero Industry Act that is putting a 50 million ton target of carbon storage. And this, you can see it as upstream supplier, the oil and gas industries. And when we look at who is buying today the BECCS in Sweden, who is buying the BECCS credits in Denmark, these are big companies that can afford to invest in carbon removal, that want to cover their scope 3 emissions, because they are aware that their activities, even if they are not the direct emitters, they produce a lot of indirect emissions, and they want to cover that. And they are maybe the ones that can afford it. So you have the panel of all that, and our role in the future for promotion of for the development of carbon removals will be to see what balance we need to find. And one last important is, polluter payers principle is good, but towards 2050, I'm afraid we'll have too much CO2 in the atmosphere. If everything goes well in Europe, we'll not have so many emitters anymore. So who is going to pay for a net negative society in 2050?
Yep, that's a very good question. I doubt we're going to answer that one right now. But Miles, I hope you've got what you wanted there. For what it's worth, I think the polluter pays principle has very good economic theory behind it. By polluter, you mean extractor or polluter, because if you're paying, if you make those who are using it pay, the incidence does differ, and it should actually, for what it's worth, I'm not on the panel, but it should go onto the shareholders. So I'll shut up. There is a fabulously upvoted question here from Holly Buck, like miles ahead of every other question. I thought Duncan McLaren had it, but it's a good one. I can see why. So well upvoted, audience. So the question is, what's one thing you wish non-policymakers understood about what policy can and can't do? Now, I thought I'd mix it up because it gets a bit boring if you just kind of go down the line every time.
Go ahead.
So you're safe.
Starting the other side.
Jen, Gideon, you can't speak at all. Jen, you most recently, let's start with the ladies, I think.
I feel like
Jen
you've got to
Fabiola.
repeat it. It was deep. Can you repeat it?
So it was, what's the one thing you wish non-policymakers understood about what policy can and can't do?
I understood.
Okay. Well, I mean, I'm not going to probably answer it exactly, but one thing I do think is tricky when I see policies that are being implemented, like 45Q, they're not it doesn't fit everything. It's kind of a dull tool, right? And we're having to take it and apply it to all these things. But at the end of the day, one gets value from carbon, which kind of incentivizes even producing carbon to then only to have to capture it. And so I do wish there was a better connection between those who are writing the policy and those who are actually having to, do the work on the ground and carry it out when it comes to achieving climate goals, and that's a disconnect.
And is there a thing that you think policy can't do, but which the average punter thinks it can and ought to? Yeah.
I think that there needs to be more feedback from the average punter, I guess, such that the policies could be more robust and kind of there's a role that kind of protects people at the end of the day. Right. So, when we're looking at the infrastructure law funding, one of the things that we can't do, because it's the bipartisan infrastructure law, right? And so there's folks on the left and folks on the right that agreed on these laws, and so it ends up being tricky. So at the end of the day, what we did in selecting awards is prioritizing those with the greatest impacts on achieving our climate goals. Mm-hmm. So it meant, we didn't have to say no to certain projects. Maybe they had upstream fossil, maybe there was downstream fossil. But essentially processes that include more handling of carbon are not as efficient as ones that don't. And so we were able to kind of make that argument, but it's not like 45Q was written that way. So.
Okay. And Fabiola, I guess as we're in the UK, rather than punters, I should talk about people on the Clapham omnibus. That's the average person. So what do you think the public in Brazil or anywhere really should be helpful for them to understand about policy, what policy can and can't do?
First, that there's only one policymaker. No, we are disputing daily, hourly. Between the executive and the legislative, but also maybe among agendas, different agendas.
Yeah, within the executive, within different departments.
Exactly. So this is very important for the non-political decision makers to understand that there's not only one. But in the other side, what the government cannot do, independently of being a government as a whole, is having top-down, approach to really bring in, because there's no any way to really have a good success on this carbon removal and also neutrality, without a strong public-private approach.
And does that disagreement by the way, I should say that's only happens in Brazil. In the UK, we all agree all the time. It's absolutely fine. But in Brazil, where you have these disagreements between different government departments, does that cause things to slow down? And you just what are the sort of problems or benefits perhaps of that you'd like the public to understand?
I think that this is also other very interesting learning from me, that I'm just by 1 year in the government now, is that we are dealing with very urgent issues now, but the political pact takes time. So dealing with this challenge, it's something that we really, but in other hands, not only between the departments, but we've been living a huge polarization that have environmental in the center of this. And one of the main bets that we are now working to guarantee the continuity of the policies that we are now rebuilding, most of them are being rebuilt at this time, is to really connect with the public-private governance bodies. Because when the society really, internalize the public policy as your own also commitment, independently of who is in the top, again, have a huge impact, but it will be minimized if you have the society, the private sector, etc., already internalize it and feel part of the public policy that was built.
Okay.
But it takes time.
All right.
Am I allowed to come in on that question just very quickly?
Okay, Edgy.
Because there are three things I think that the governments can't do very easily. And some people think they can do, one of which is to really regulate the voluntary market properly. If person A wants to flog something to person B, they can just get on and do it. You can try and regulate it, but there's only so much you can do in the voluntary markets. Governments find it difficult to make international agreements. We see how bloody hard that is through UNFCCC. It's not impossible, but it's hard. And governments are not good at moving quickly. So rapid action. is often tricky.
Right, and that can be very frustrating for the public to get a handle on. Gideon, you just answered, I think, Duncan's question, which should governments be more interventionist to tackle the shortcomings of markets for carbon dioxide removal? I guess you said not in the voluntary market, perhaps, but perhaps in regulated markets.
Well, I think we should try and get more engaged. Government should try and get more engaged in the voluntary market. But it is tricky because the market is almost by definition moving more quickly than governments can keep up. So you can try and regulate in that space, but it's tricky. Certainly you can try and impose recommended MRV and such like. But when it comes to the more formal mandated government-led processes, then of course you have a role to.
Okay, and before I come to Fabien, I just want to see if I can tick off another one here quite quickly. This is a UK question, but it's at the top of the list. Parochial lot that you are. Should non-permanent removals be integrated into the UK and or the EU ETS compliance markets and be fungible with permanent removals? The person who asked this didn't want to state their name. Ooh. So fungibility between permanent and non-permanent removals, Gideon and Fabien.
Yeah, I think there's some quite interesting work, academic work and other work, to try and work out how we do that. And I don't think it's beyond the realms of possibility, but it needs to be done with care. And we do need to know how long the duration of non-permanent is and value it appropriately. And there are other problems in that space, like what do we do with methane in these markets, that I think are going to need to be dealt with at the same time.
So you're saying it's complex. Over to you, Fabien.
Yeah, it is. Now, what can I say on that? So we have this certification framework for carbon removal where the objective is really this, to put things in a way that they are comparable. So to develop methodologies and that you are very clear on what you have. If it's temporary, it's clear that it's temporary. If it's permanent, then it's certified that it's permanent. I think that if you want to make things that are permanent and not permanent, you are going to face some issue and you will need to find something to convert the non-permanent in permanent. There were some interesting tries, but not very popular. And for instance, I can mention the Tournier accounting. And at the level of the Article 6, there were a lot of discussion on that. And the results of this discussion has decided to not use this approach. So I think it's quite important to keep things comparable. And if we find some sources of emissions that are maybe not as permanent as CO2, maybe temporary carbon removal could play a role. I'm thinking about methane emissions, for instance. Right. But if we want to compensate for permanent CO2 emission in the atmosphere, then a cautious approach is probably the best one.
Okay, fabulous, thank you. The next one definitely looks like it's yours, Jen. How can CDR, as a field, become more resilient to political shifts? I mean, perhaps there's one for Gideon too. But the question goes on, again, anonymous. Projects and communities in the US, for example, worry that everything will deteriorate this November. What would you say?
Right. No, yeah, that's a valid fear. I think what we did, though, is really build things and build a framework in place that will help against that and make what we've built sustainable. A lot of this work that we're talking about is very bipartisan. And but one thing that could be a slippery slope is that we didn't have to require that the plans take care of people. We didn't have to require a community benefits plan. That was part of this administration. And so it could be that you can see some of these things that we put in place that are hard to do. These are barriers for applicants. You could see some of that shifting. I worry a little bit about the accounting, of how the accounting is done. Truly additional projects, making sure that it's maximum net carbon removed from the atmosphere, drawing big boxes in terms of boundary conditions. And so those are the types of things I worry about, but I don't see projects being, erased, for instance, or going back.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Good.
If you wanted, let me move on. This is one from Mai. Thank you, Mai. So the VCM, Voluntary Carbon Market, is making some progress on MRV, monitoring, reporting, verification. And I'm going to ask this, I think, starting with Gideon. Do you think carbon dioxide removal through the voluntary carbon market has any role to play in delivering national emission targets?
That's a good question. I think Well, I'm not going to. I struggle to answer it directly, but I think one thing that I think is important is that we ought to try and learn from the failures of the voluntary carbon market in terms of emissions in the negative carbon market in the voluntary space.
I mean, worries about additionality and
and it's basically not trusted, the voluntary carbon market in many quarters, and people are trying to move away from it, and we don't want to end up in the same place. So
I'm sure there'd be people here who would disagree.
Yeah, I'm sure there would be, but the level of trust is not high. I think that's probably true. So I think we need to try and get to the point where we are able to trust the voluntary market for negative emissions. One thing I'd say quite forcefully here is we need to get on with this, and there's only so much that governments can do in terms of funding the R&D. So actually the early stage deployment that's happening through the voluntary market is itself research and development, and we need that research and development to be seen in an open way. So the more open the voluntary market can be about what they're doing, what the MRV is, what the measurements they're making to prove it are, the more likely we are to get to a trusted system. So I'll stop there, but openness of that early deployment system is critical for me.
Okay, I've got to follow. I mean, just Fabiola, you're on warning for a question about legal liability of reversals. It's coming your way soon. Just have a ponder of that. But before that, I think Maya's question also is possibly a sort of an accounting question too. So if you've got a voluntary ton, can that play any? Are there Article 6 issues? Is there accounting issues with national targets that potentially cause trouble here? Maybe that's
it's tricky to build that into nationally determined contributions, but it's not impossible.
Okay.
I think
all right, leave it there. All right. So Luke has a question. As I say, Fabiola, I'm going to give this to you to start with about the legal liability for reversals. So this is if you've stored some carbon and then bump, up it comes. Maybe your trees go up in smoke, somebody logs them and grazes some cattle somewhere in the Amazon or elsewhere. Luke wasn't necessarily saying this is a Brazilian issue. What role can governments play in defining the terms or providing some sort of guarantees about reversals?
First, start with a short comment on the question that Gideon just answered. The restoration is a very interesting example where the voluntary market can really play a role in the NDC, because we are seeing a huge wave of investments coming to Brazil to implement restoration projects and having carbon credits in the next 10 to 15 years. So the investments comes from companies that needs to neutralize their own footprint, and for sure that this restoration restored hectares will be also included into the land sector plan, into the mitigation climate plan, and etc. So anyway, I cannot see how we will really separate in some kind of a specific project. But on the other hand, I think the carbon market regulation in Brazil is such a complex topic. To really bring the proper answer to what was asked here, I think that it will take more time, and I'm really not sure if I'm the right person to respond. Yeah, this is true. It's a big responsibility being here and representing a country. So we are still dealing with a big technical, scientific, and also political disputes to really have all of these answers agreed. But there's a commitment by COP30, for sure by COP29, mainly now, to have some of the answers that was. And I can also put you in contact, whoever it is, with the best person to answer.
Luke, you can come and talk. Come up after the panel, Luke, is done. Now, I want to move to one about making sure that we extract value from taxpayers' dollars. I'm going to ping this to Fabien and to Jen. So when you've got government subsidies, for instance, your DAC hubs, how do we ensure that this leads to full public dissemination of all of the performance data and all of the lessons from that experience? Are we doing that? Can we do that? Is it reasonable to do that? How do we do it?
Sure. So there are certain aspects of the process that are transparent. In terms of environmental protection, there are permits that are in place. Some parts of those permits are public. In fact, before they go through, there's a public comment period so that the public knows a project is being, considered, for instance, for permitting. And that's any kind of large demonstration project. There's also, if you're putting the carbon underground, there's also a permit process. It's through the Environmental Protection Agency called Class 6. So there's these stages and gates where the public is fully aware of the project and it's moving, whether it's going to move forward or not, and the impacts it could potentially have. And then in terms of the lessons learned from technology and costs of the projects themselves, many of these are just getting started now, and those are part of the negotiation stage that the government is having with the applicants and lots of lawyers, but that's the hope. I will say the office that I was in at DOE, we had made a kind of a step such that all of the community benefits plans are public. And that office is making all of those public, but not even across the Department of Energy, there's silos. And so we hope that we were providing an example for our colleagues. But it's very tricky. This is not as straightforward because many companies feel like their data is proprietary and that they don't necessarily want to share that. And it's tricky because you need to know truly what the first of a kind costs are.
Right, exactly.
So that we can
exactly.
figure this out. And so that's active right now in these first of a kind negotiations.
So Fabien, I'd love, if you disagree with Jen, I'd love to hear it. Or if a brief addition, I'd love to hear that too. Otherwise, I've got another question directly for you.
Let's take the other question.
The next one. Okay, so I'm going to read this out word for word. It's from Matthias. The Net Zero Industry Act demands that oil and gas extractors in the EU contribute to geological CO2 storage capacity in proportion to their fossil extraction. Question, is there scope to also demand fossil extractors to finance capture and transport?
Yeah. We are not at this stage yet in this Net Zero Industry Act. But obviously, some people are interested by this question, and thank you to ask it. I cannot give you an answer right today on how we are going to design the policies in the future, but we need to look at these options like we were going to look at other options. Is it feasible to get inspired by what we have done under the Net Zero Industry Act and to ask a little bit more to fossil fuel extractor than just providing the injection capacity. The negotiations on this file were not so easy, so there is no easy answer, but we have to be honest and look at the different options available. And I will also do a link on the previous questions, because this is also a relevant one for geological storage. In the Communication on Industrial Carbon Management that we have published also earlier in this year, we listed the different action, and one of the action was indeed for this sharing data, sharing knowledge on existing project or the project that we are going to finance through grants or other aspects in the near future, and to facilitate the dissemination of this knowledge. And one element that we think are important is when we talk about carbon storage in the geological formation in Europe, we know that companies, oil and gas companies, have a lot of knowledge about the geological structure around Europe, and that could be very useful for the industry of storage. We try to put in place a structure that will help the companies to share this information in the way that can satisfy both sides.
Super. Okay, I think Matthias.
Can I quickly build on that?
Yeah, go on.
So I hope everyone in this room would agree with the fact that we've got to drive down emissions, and that's got to be the primary goal. And the negative emissions is to clean up the last bits that we really can't do. So in reference to my earlier comment about who pays, I would hope if you can get the big oil and gas companies to get to the point where they are doing CCS at scale because of emissions reductions, you have got through the market failure, you've generated the market, and then the negative emission aspects of it could actually happen because it's a vibrant market without government incentives or regulation.
Okay, we're fast running out of time. I think we're going to perhaps have one more question here. I'm going to merge two together, and then I might just see if there's somebody desperate to ask a question in the room who, hasn't got into the 21st century, doesn't have a phone. And Axel will be here somewhere, so you can take that up. So David and Eli, I'm going to kind of blend your questions together. Eli says, if you allocate the global carbon budget by population, then 3 out of 4 of you, representing your relative regions, EU, UK, US, have exhausted your budgets already, and you're into carbon debt territory. Maybe we should be thinking differently about removals in that context. And David says 10 gigatons of CO2 a year, removed at, say, $100 a ton, is $1 trillion a year. It's it's not quite the opposite of Eli's question, but his question is, why would the rich countries do this when they can be spending their money on better things, immediate things? So he hasn't put this, but your renewables reducing emissions may be costing you negative amounts of money net. Why do this now when there are other things that you could do that are more cost effective and arguably more urgent? So, what do we think, representatives of the rich, polluting, debted countries? Jen, go on. The US is the extreme example.
Okay. How I think about this is true. We are responsible. We're responsible for what we're doing today. We're responsible historically, and yet, in the global South, they're feeling it first and worst, right? And so, one of the things that we have done recently, and I'm not there anymore, but as of like a couple weeks ago, we did a request for information from all of the big industrial sectors. And we wanted to understand, if we're investing in the United States, the seeds of these first-of-a-kind demonstrations to decarbonize and in some cases remove, are there companies in the global South or locations of these same companies, parent companies, such that we can take the lessons learned in the United States and decarbonize steel and cement in Nigeria, And if we can do direct air capture coupled to geothermal in Nevada, or in Southern California, can we also do it in Kenya? And can we think about leveraging these investments? And not just that, but can we also think about building out the human capital at the universities too, so that they have people on the ground with expertise that can really help to build the solutions that make sense to those communities, because it's not the same types of solutions in every region. And so really kind of figuring out what resources are on the ground in communities globally and leveraging that and making sure it's really what they believe in too.
So if I were channeling a skeptical Eli, he's probably in the audience
right there.
somewhere.
I
Is
see
he
him.
right there? I'd imagine he's thinking, well, that actually does sound quite good, but how much of that can you do? And is it going to come anywhere near to the totality of the carbon debt? And don't we need something more at scale? You can tell me afterwards whether I channeled you correctly. I can't even see where you are.
I'm sure, but one thing I wouldn't want to do is say that we should put all of our resources only towards decarbonizing. I think we just need to recognize we need to invest in both. We recognize no matter what residual calculation you do, that somehow it's going to come out to gigatons. And we are not near that today, and we've got to scale up 6 zeros. And if we don't invest now, we're just not going to have it in time.
Yeah. Okay, I doubt anybody disagrees with that. Is there any disagreement on the panel? Gideon, you look like you want to chime in.
I agree, but we have to primarily put the focus on reducing emissions. That has got to be the main focus. But I do agree with Jen that we also have to, we will need some negative. We're going to need to put the R&D in and the early deployment to get there. In terms of the question, if I can quickly come back on that. So I think I would frame it as well, rather than we're in debt and we need to pay back that debt, rather than it simply meaning we need to do some negative carbon stuff. I think it means we need to show leadership internationally in reversing the climate challenge and reducing emissions ourselves, and helping the world to come out of the challenge that we got it into in the first place. And if we're going to try and do that by offshoring, so just do negative or doing emissions reductions in other countries, that's a very dangerous territory. because of the problem we created. We damaged the planet. We don't want to just offshore the fix unless we pay for it adequately, and that's our justification for paying large amounts for this, is that it's a way of helping the whole world to decarbonize.
Okay, fair enough. Now, I make it 5. I'm going to ask for your indulgence to have one question from the floor, just for a little bit of excitement, and you all did come in late, so, I think it's okay if we end a couple of minutes late. So I'll go right here in the middle, the woman with the kind of Albany ready, not sure. There we go. Thank you.
Yeah, the question is not from me. It's the second one voted up in the app.
Oh, I missed it. Oh,
Yes.
I'm in trouble.
So you can, I hand over to you.
Not only am I, thank you very much, I appreciate that. Not only am I in trouble, it is the elephant in the room. So there's been this massive elephant over there.
It's after 5 though, we've got to go.
No. Fossil fuel companies in rich countries buying cheap, questionable, perhaps non-durable CDR credits in poorer countries and regions. What should we do about it?
Stop it.
Thank you very much. Stop it. All right, that's it. We're done. Did you have anything else to say? Anybody?
Well, now in Europe, we have started a discussion on that, and we are working on what we call green claims. So try to regulate the kind of claims that you can do in Europe when you say you are climate neutral. What does it mean? What is behind this climate neutrality? And on this, we are looking at all different aspects. We are looking at the balance between emission reductions and carbon removal. And we are also looking at how to be sure that when offsets or credits are used, we can be sure about the quality of the offset. But I don't want to say we should never use offset, because I think it's important. We have to do carbon removals where it's the most efficient. And this is true that we had some issues in the past, and also at the level of the ETS, at the level of the European policies and the carbon market on the ETS, the introduction of credits in the ETS was an issue. But we need to be very careful and to be transparent and communicate in a fair way on this.
Okay, so stop it, regulate it. Any other bids?
Just one comment also connected with the last question. The current geopolitical context and also the global trade put us in a situation where it's not, only poor and rich or forest-based countries, and because all of this is now connected by different forces, which is the companies and the big companies, and so I think that the example that you brought is very important, and this is why the carbon cannot be only an economical project, cannot be only drove by market, needs to be regulated, needs to be not only regulated by countries, but by the conventions and the multilateralism. We need to put this in the, because if you leave to the market, if you leave to the força do mercado, the carbon market also was planned to not live always, it's a palliative solution until we do not have an economic model where forest and also environmental services and also are considered as a real value.
Great, super. Thank you. Jen, did you have a final? No, you're good. Did you have a final?
Nothing
Closing comment?
Not on that.
Great, because I make it 5:04, but with apologies to everybody, we're 4 minutes late. But thank you for a very interesting discussion. Please thank you.